Hello and welcome to episode 14 of this Inspired 2020 Visionary Chat Series. I'm really privileged and delighted to be joined today by Sally Helgesen. Sally, how are you?
I'm very good. I'm good. I'm glad to be here, Simon.
It's great to see you. So Sally is a premier expert on women's leadership, best-selling author of a number of books, and most recently, How Women Rise. I know you co-authored that with Marshall Goldsmith, who I know well. You've written The Female Vision, Women's Real Power at Work, and many other bodies of work. You're a keynote speaker. You've consulted to the UN. You've taught at Harvard Business School. So you're highly accoladed, and it's a real honor to chat with you. So welcome again, Sally. So what I'd like to do really in the time that we have is maybe if you can talk for a few minutes about you, your background, and how you got to be where you are today.
Oh, certainly. Women's leadership was not a field I thought about or aspired to. In the 1980s, I was working in corporate communications in a number of companies. Before that, I'd been mostly a journalist, so I was always a writer. That's been the constant of my adult life. And in corporate communications, I was doing a lot of speech writing. And what was very apparent to me, that we're talking about the late 80s, and women had started to come into the workplace, beginning in significant numbers, very little influence, very little opportunity to use their voices in any kind of strategic way.
Yes.
And yet what I saw in the companies I was working for, which were very good companies, that there was no recognition and understanding of what women had to contribute, again, in terms of thought, in terms of ideas, in terms of positioning and strategy and all the big picture things. There was just no concept of it, and no real idea of what women, had to offer as leaders. So I wanted to, in some way, address that. What I decided to do was to write a book focusing on how some of the best women leaders led. The idea was that organizations would see that and think, oh, well, we're missing the boat. So I began doing diary studies of some outstanding women leaders. That book became The Female Advantage, Women's Ways of Leadership, published in 1990, still in print. But it was the first book that looked at what women had to contribute as leaders, rather than how they needed to change and adapt. And because there was nothing else like that, all the other books for women were, talk about football, you don't take offense at dirty jokes, be one of the guys. Because it was different, people were very intrigued by it, and companies started asking me in. They asked me in to talk to their women. They asked me in to talk to their men. They asked me in to, consult on leadership programs. So it just began, I think, because it really was the first one, it started to take off. And I thought, this is fantastic. This is such an interesting field. There's so many different things I can explore here and ways I can be part of this. And so that was 30 years ago, and I have stuck with it through thick and thin, and it's been extremely gratifying writing more books. And I've done this all around the world, and that's really one of the exciting things about this work, is seeing the consistency with which women's skills and also what gets in their way is consistent around the globe.
Wow. And it's funny because I travel a lot. Well, before the lockdown, I was traveling a lot. And I remember about a year ago, I was sitting in London, less than a year, and I met a female engineer who's Australian, but working in Ireland, but I met her in London. And she was sitting outside a cafe and she was reading a book, and it was How Women Rise.
That's so great. I know. It's really, we've sold it in 19 languages. So it definitely has a global impact.
Yeah. So the whole, but as I said before we started recording, for me, I just find I'm just incredulous that you even still have to push this area, because, I was basically brought up by my mother and my grandmother, and I live at home with a wife and two daughters. So I've always been surrounded by the feminine, right? And I wrote an article about 2 years ago for a publisher in the UK, Globe Law and Business, called Gender Balance for Better Business. I co-wrote the article. And what really compelled me to write it was, I've written books on closing deals and business, but I hadn't really seen much in the space around the feminine in the negotiating and deal making space. So it drew, and I'm not an academic, but I started researching and I saw that there's been a lot of studies in the military space that show that when the feminine is involved in closing deals, they tend to be more sustainable, right? But in the business space, I didn't see much. I didn't see a huge amount. Now, I read the studies from Sheryl Sandberg at Facebook, etc. But it's just a huge area. And to me, it's complete common sense that the best businesses, I'm not talking about positive discrimination or diversity, I'm talking gender balance,
Right.
Gender balance. What do you think about the whole area of gender balance? Is it not spoken enough about? Or what do you think?
I think that, in my world, I hear it spoken about quite a bit. I think that it's always been that many companies, many organizations aren't quite sure how to move forward on it.
Yeah.
The fundamental issue is, to me, that historically the workplace that we are part of, even as we move out of industrial culture, was designed by and for men, based on maximizing some of what men's most powerful skills and instincts are, minimizing those that they lack, and also based on the presumption that somebody else was home taking care of the children and the domestic sphere of life. So you had that functioning workplace that had, really began in the industrial era, and then women came into it, and we weren't really quite sure how that was going to go. So a lot of the adaptations that have been kind of small bore, and we've had turning points, and I think, in my view, things have progressed along, quite rapidly, given the cultural and structural constraints that were on organizations. And it was really, in my experience, not until we got into this century that we recognized that the likelihood of one half of the human race coming into organizations was not going to effectively change much. That in fact it changes everything, and that those changes play out over time. So I believe that the other thing that's happened is, the shift in the nature of the technology and the architecture and the shape of the technology has also supported the changes that women have brought, because they've really mandated a new approach to leadership that's much less hierarchical. So all those things have played in together, and I think have created a world in which gender balance is more vitally important than it has ever been, and more a part of how organizations will shift to cultures and structures that really have efficacy in the world that we're part of now.
I think you're so right. And, when I was doing the research, I looked at the pillars of religion and the military and politics and business, and it was all male oriented. But it's interesting today, we'll get on to the current situation we're in globally, and I call it a circuit breaker. And I'm not going to talk about politics, but it's interesting that, four of the countries with some of the highest rates of mortality from this virus are run by men of a certain persuasion, right? Very dictatorial type men, right? Whereas some of the real success stories, I mean, Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand is an inspiration to billions, right? And so I don't think it's a coincidence that some of those better run jurisdictions are run by the feminine. Is there something in that? That's the first question. The second question is, I think in an ironic way, this can only help crystallize the common sense that you talk about, that the need for the world to be more balanced. What do you think?
I could not agree more. First of all, is it a coincidence? It's not a coincidence. Look, there are very few women who are heads of countries in this world. And when you look, that 6 of the 8 countries that have had the most successful responses
Yep.
to the pandemic have been countries run by women.
Yep.
That is extraordinary. In the United States, the female governor of Michigan, she took their rate from number 3 in the nation to number 29. That is unprecedented in the United States. So I think having those kinds of examples is very, very powerful. And it's powerful for a couple of reasons. One of the things, since I've been writing and since there's been more acknowledgement of what women have to contribute, there has been more widespread acknowledgement that women are that sort of win-win negotiators, that women are really skilled at motivating people and engaging them, and that there are a lot of skills women bring. But it's always been believed that men are better in leading a crisis. Possibly because we haven't had many examples of women in crisis. So here we have vivid examples of women excelling in leading in crisis. There's another thing I think that's more grassroots that's happened that complements that, which is the idea of the first responder. You know, historically with the military, the people on the front lines, those are the people who are viewed as keeping the populace, the civilian populace, safe. When we were in the 9/11 world, when we were in the world where, you know, Western countries were so obsessed with terrorism, we put a lot of emphasis on the heroism of the first responders, the people who put themselves on the front lines to keep other people safe. They were mostly firemen and policemen, you know, at least 90% male. But here, the first responders have been people in the healthcare field. And those are, in many countries, predominantly women. So I think, again, you get this image of women in a heroic role as keeping the community safe. You begin to get, at almost a mythological level, a new impression of what female leadership is. Heroism, decisiveness, and safety. Crisis capability. And so I think the impact is going to be very significant and long term.
I agree. I couldn't agree more. And, you know, I write and I lecture about deal making and negotiation and leadership and building confidence for resilient business. And I talk about 3 aspects of strong leadership, and they are calm, compassionate, which you'd associate with the feminine, and courageous. Now, a lot of people would associate that with the masculine, but the feminine has to be courageous. You know, I mean, given what the feminine has been through in history, and you know, Eckhart Tolle talks about the pain body, and the feminine pain body has had to endure more. Do you agree with that? That if anything, you know, there's a real kind of irresistible mix of calm, compassion, and courage in the feminine that for all those biases we haven't really acknowledged. And I think it's really starting to show now.
It's been acknowledged on the calm and the compassion, and under-acknowledged on the courage.
Correct.
You know, certainly there's been the recognition that mothers are courageous, but that has been more private and domestic, not in terms of the community. And that's what I'm really seeing a shift here, is that demonstration of women as courageous and decisive leaders in a crisis, on the front lines, keeping the community safe, in the public world, not just as mothers, that is really creates a big fundamental shift. And it's supported also by the fact that we live in a time when there are more and more women in the military, and beginning to see women on the front lines in the military. So I think all of those things are really, really important. And they are going to play a strong role in building more gender balanced leadership models. And that's really what excites me here. It's not just more gender balance in an organization, you know, because I hear organizations all the time, we're hiring 50% of our hires are women. You know, then you get to the top and it's 10%. it's the model, our understanding of what excellence in leadership
Exactly.
is becoming a more gender balanced
Yes.
model. And this has been happening since the 90s, partly because of the pressure of technology and then the demographic change. But I think we're at, you called it a circuit breaker. I love
Circuit
that.
breaker.
I think we're at a circuit breaking point here with this.
I think so. I think so. So just on that point. So in terms of leadership and coaching, so let's talk about leadership. So leadership in a crisis, okay, and this, whether we like it or not, this is a period of crisis, okay. Humankind always comes through this, but this is a period of crisis. I call it a circuit breaker. How do you see that impacting good leadership? How do you see good leadership needing to change or pivot during this period, or as a result of this period?
Well, in terms of the business leaders,
Yeah.
I see who are not doing a good job right now, they tend to be not using this as any time for reflection. From almost the day the lockdowns began, the rolling lockdowns, they began at different points in different countries, you heard business leaders say, we're pivoting our whole business. Our business model is going to be X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
Very, very quickly. They wanted to appear effective and decisive. And it often was a poor idea because, as in any very large and very complex crisis, that's not just a hurricane that, messes things up and that you begin rebuilding from, but very complex that unfolds over time. Conditions change. So having that ability to say, okay, we're not quite sure where we are. We're trying to take in a lot of information. We're being reflective. We're learning. We know things are going to change, but we're not quite sure the direction. That ability to exhibit that sort of leadership humility, I think, was a very, very important part of being able to navigate this well. The other thing that I've seen that's been very unsuccessful with some leaders, and I hear about this a lot, is where the leaders are putting tremendous pressure on their people to meet certain targets, even though their people's lives have completely changed and they need time to adjust to it. I was talking to a woman who was a provost at she was the first assistant to a provost at a very significant university, and she was saying, our people are now working, and many of them are homeschooling, and they've got all this. They don't have access to some of the files that they used to have. Our technology is a little bit behind the curve, and yet the provost demands that certain things be done at certain periods and certain schedules. He's very inflexible about it, and he doesn't seem to realize how much people's lives have changed. So I think that's another thing that an awareness of other people's situations and an ability to listen to it and to recognize that listening to it doesn't mean you're giving people an excuse not to show up, but really that we're all sort of making this up as we go along. We're on a frontier here, and a classic frontier. That those things are really important skills.
I agree. I think I spoke to Marshall about this, and also John Mattone, around the whole area of and Eduardo Brasenio from Growth from Mindset Works about. I asked him whether vulnerability. In fact, I came up with this after the conversation, and I posted about vulnerability being more important than ego for leadership at any time, but particularly now. And it sounds to me like that's what you're saying, that without giving away the houses, without giving away corporate secrets. I mean, as a C-suite executive, your responsibility is to the shareholders. So you still need to be courageous and firm. But I think, and what drove me to say that was that in my experience, I've been a CEO and I've met some amazing CEOs, and the best CEOs don't cover up the truth. They say it as it is. So if things are tough, because if you do cover things up, stakeholders aren't silly. They start wondering and filling the gaps, the communication gaps. And of course, they fill that with anxiety. So do you agree with that the best leaders also need to be as honest and open as they corporately can?
Definitely. They need to be as transparent as possible.
Yep.
And one of the reasons they need to do that is because they need real information from their people.
Yeah.
And their people will not provide that if they see that that's not what the senior executive really wants. And when we see terrible flameouts of great companies, we witnessed an example last year, terrible flameout, great company. What you heard over and over was that people in the organization were afraid to share real information because they knew it was what the CEO did not want to hear, and that they not only would not be listened to, but they would be punished for it. So the only way to set that example, you can share with me the numbers. Are they bad? Are we looking at a situation that has the potential to develop here that could be a real problem? We need to know. You can't do that unless you yourself are comfortable sharing real information, being transparent, and transparency always requires a degree of vulnerability.
Absolutely. So moving on then, so we've spoken just briefly about leadership in business. What about the whole coaching profession? So I'm a Marshall Goldsmith coach amongst many things, and there are a lot of coaches out there in this particular period. Some of them are excelling, some of them are struggling, some of them are looking to pivot or to accelerate into a different direction. How do you see this crisis as changing what good coaching requires? How is this changing the coaching landscape, or should it be used to accelerate certain trends within coaching?
That I don't think is quite clear yet. I think the one thing that I can say that's very clear about coaching is we are going to switch to a lot less in-person meeting, and that our coaching sessions will be more like what you and I are doing now. So I believe that will have a real impact. And I don't know how, there's some information we're going to miss by not being on the ground and not sitting in the meetings with people.
Absolutely.
And that's a loss. On the other hand, just in terms of the efficiency of what we do, not flying halfway around the world to meet with a coaching client for an hour and a half, there's a real gain there. So I think that the two things I can say as our coaching, virtual participation will be a much bigger part of coaching. And I think that our coaching will become more global because we will be doing it that way, and that will be there'll be many benefits in that to both coaches and coachees having greater sort of cross-cultural connection.
It's interesting because I've written an article recently for Irish Tech News about, is this period a period where human beings communicate socially? Okay, so we collaborate socially, and technology is, by its definition, the opposite of that. Okay, but is this a period where we're really going to see an acceleration of the two coming together? And nobody knows the answer, as you said. And it's interesting, talking to some experts. Some of them say, in a funny way, of course, 93% of communication is body language. So we're missing an awful lot of that online. Okay, so there are negatives, but in a funny way, there are positives, because you and I are here completely focused on each other, and we're not distracted by a lot of the social things that happen when you're in a room together. So I think there are pluses and minuses, as you say, but I don't think anybody really knows how this is going to play out in terms of the validity or strength or outcomes of coaching. I think in years to come, there will be books written about how coaching dynamics have changed as a result of this, and probably lots of positive and negative ways, which I think is what you were saying.
Yes, and the body language, it's very interesting because up until this crisis started, coaching was a fairly small part of my work in recent years because I was on the road all the time doing workshops and programs around how women rise.
Yes.
And pretty much continually for 2 years at least. Then it all stopped. Now I've been doing a lot of podcasts and webinars, and what I've seen is that in this medium, and I was very skeptical about how this would translate,
Me too.
that intensity of the personal encounter,
Yeah.
some of that intensity is gone, but we make up for it in intimacy.
Yeah.
That there's an intimacy in this medium, especially when somebody's not endlessly screen sharing, which kind of, I find cuts that.
I agree.
But when there's an intimacy to this medium,
Yeah.
that I think it also helps me realize how much of your body language is translated in your face, neck, and shoulders.
Yes.
So I think that's really important. I think there are gains that we're making, even as there are aspects we're losing.
I think you're right. There are efficiency gains, and it's also interesting. You mentioned the world. I think the world will get smaller in terms of getting access to real expertise. I mean, just doing this series here, I've reached out to 21, leaders and visionaries and thinkers like yourself, and 19 unequivocally said yes. And I suspect that wouldn't have been as easy before the period.
Absolutely not.
No.
I mean, I'm doing things like I did, Career Day in Moscow, and a 2-hour program for the Young Leader Academy of Yerevan, Armenia. Now, these are not things, I was on the road all the time. I didn't say yes to these kinds of things. My schedule was wild. Yeah. So it's been very, very gratifying. And I think you're right that it just spreads, good content worldwide in ways that are quite unexpected.
I think so, and inspiring new people. So really, to bring this to an end, Sally, I always ask everybody 2 or 3 things, and I'll personalize this. So I have 2 daughters, 21 and nearly 20, and one is studying politics and French, and one is studying science. Okay, and so they're going to be future leaders, hopefully in their own areas, to a greater or lesser extent. If you were going to whisper 2 or 3 words of wisdom or encouragement or direction setting to them to be leaders, female leaders of the future, what would you say to them?
What I find is that the most effective female leaders, or leaders in general, are individuals who are very intentional about what they want to contribute to the world, well connected, that is, and they engage the people they have connections with to help them act on what their intention is.
Yes.
And fully present, that is not distracted by what's going on. So whenever I teach, I try to use that as a template: intentional, connected, and present. Wow. It starts with intention. And I think the best way of thinking about what your intention is in the big picture way is, what is the one thing that you want most to contribute to the world? It's a helpful way for women to frame that, because they are often more comfortable framing as contribution rather than achievement. Yeah. But the clearer that you are about what that contribution is, and it can change over time, the better you'll have a start in terms of leadership, because great leadership is always highly intentional.
I agree. That's so powerful. And it's been wonderful chatting with you, and it would be wonderful to keep in touch. And thanks so much for your time. How do people find out more about the work that you do? Websites and other resources?
Certainly. My website has lots of resources, sallyhelgesen.com. Also, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. I prefer that as a platform because it's very positive. People don't say negative things about each other. It's all, oh, you're wonderful too. So I like that. So those are ways people reach out to me on LinkedIn, or or my website has a contact button, then I get a lot of inquiries that way.
Perfect. It's been wonderful chatting with you, Sally, and thanks so much for your time, and take care and keep safe.
Thank you. You too, Simon. Really
Thank you.
enjoyed.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.